actually started. Oh, okay. So I didn't actually push the go live button. Hi, everybody. I apologize for that. So I'm going to start over. I guess it actually looks like I'm going now. I'm here. I'm Allison. I'm sitting in my living room. The day is waning away. I've been trying to teach myself today a bit about live streaming with a picture in a picture. And Jason always is so lovely to give me so much of his time and his editing skills, but he's got a lot of other stuff going on. And this was a topic that I really wanted to touch on while it was still timely. And so anyway, so I'm gonna just try this out, but I'm gonna look over and see. Oh, good. Okay, so there's someone here. All right. Thank you for leaving a comment, because I haven't done this before and I'm not sure how it's working. So, okay, so I want to highly recommend Raul's newest piece on Silicon Icarus. It's called Building the Impact Finance Regime, Nigeria's Civil War and the Road to Cyber Colonialism. And, you know, whenever I read Raul's pieces, it takes me several times to get it together because I don't know the history, right? I mean, when I was in school, and I went to a good public school, but literally, like, they would take you up through the Second World War, they would sprinkle in a little bit of Vietnam, and maybe you had some current events, and that was it. Like, you never really understood, and clearly we had a very US-centric view. We were taught really next to nothing about African history. So this piece that Raul goes into is something we should all know about, and then understand how it actually fits in with the creation of development finance, the development finance space, and the role of investors and faith-based communities and resource extractivism, because it's all wrapped up in Nigeria and it all never went away. It just sort of repackaged itself. And a lot of it is packaged around things that sound wonderful. They sound liberal and progressive and like they want to care about you, only it really is about channeling global capital. So the story that I'll just give you a brief overview, and I will say, if you have, the resources to support Raul as a patron, that would be great. He actually also just sent a recent newsletter with additional material about the Barclays and sort of the Quaker origins of a lot of these financial deals. So it's definitely worthwhile. So essentially what the arc of this story is, and it interfaces with the work that I was doing this past month too. It's interesting how we end up sort of bumping around similar territories around refugees and the faith-based communities management of charter cities. So that's what I was working on. Where it overlaps with what Raul is working on is looking into the nature of the Biafran War, the Nigerian Civil War that happened. It took place between 1967 and 1971. Now, Nigeria had just achieved its independence from England, I think, in 1961. So not many years later, oil was discovered in Nigeria in the late 50s, and there was an oil boom in the years leading up to the war, and that a big presence in that was Dutch Shell oil. So what's important to know about the country of Nigeria, which I was not aware of, but that when they decolonized it, essentially they created a country that had three very different cultural groups that had different priorities, and then they sort of set them up for failure. They set them up against each other in ways of like managing and governance and money and control of resources. And then ultimately that fell apart, and when it did, the West played roles in terms of exacerbating this civil war by providing supplies that prolonged the engagement, because really the South that had seceded, they didn't have much in the way of weapons and other things. And what was so terrible about this war, besides all war is terrible, but during the 4 years that it went on, beyond the people who died in the military conflict, which was several hundreds of thousands of people, and people who were killed in their communities because of ethnic conflict or cultural conflict, there were several million people who died of starvation. And they died because normally their food access was through the sea, through fishing and seafood, and that was cut off by blockades. And then the West played a certain role in terms of airlifting in food, but often that food also came with armaments and guns. And that was overseen by various faith-based interests, including Caritas and the Catholic Church, but not exclusively. And there was some jockeying for position there. And so today, all of our understanding of, I'm just going to try to see if I can, just trying. I was hoping I could actually see the chat on my phone, but I guess I can't do that, which is a bummer. So if you just hold on with me for a second, I just want to double check and see if, oh yes, oh there are stuff. Okay, great. Oh, thank you for being there. All right, I'm just gonna trust that you're there. I can't see the chat because I can't figure out how to do that, but I'm gonna keep going. So they starved to death. They didn't have access to food. Food was brought in, and it was all televised. And this was a really key point that Roel makes, is that this was the first televised war. Like, this happened before the broadcasts from Vietnam. So this predated that. And essentially, the West had scripted sort of PR firms managing how the tone of the war was conveyed. And a lot of the cultural conflict also played in with the fact that the South had more of a Catholic community. So that was a big part of this. And this overlaps with what I was doing in my work with later on this woman, Barbara Ward, who's involved in Vatican II and sort of the global North is sort of somehow providing justice to the global South due to all of this want. But the idea of that many of us grew up with was of the starving African children. Like, this was part of a manufactured, I think as Roel even says, like a ritual killing of these people to essentially seed the ground for this new phase of global development aid and humanitarian aid and interventions, which, as we know, is going to, is quickly veering off into the blockchain cybernetic space. So, that's sort of the overall arching, but within this, Barbara Ward was a key figure that I was not aware of. So she is sort of like the godmother of sustainable poverty, anti-poverty. She was from the UK. Her father was Quaker and her mother was Catholic, and so she sort of threaded the needle. She was very connected. She was trained at the Sorbonne and then somehow just landed at Harvard for 10 years to do international policy as a guest, and then landed at Columbia University in New York and was there for maybe 7 years. And she worked closely with Morris Strong on the first United Nations Environmental Summit in 1972, which I believe was in Stockholm. So, you hear about Gro Harlem Brundtland and the Rio Summit, and you hear about Maurice Strong. I had never heard of Barbara, so I really am grateful to Roel for putting her on my radar, because I think she's actually really important. And so when I started digging around, I found this long biographical document about her and all of these books she wrote about Spaceship Earth and the very cybernetic construct, very Malthusian population control, sort of, Fabian socialist, libertarian, paternalist outlook of, the wealthy elite of the North, and with all their productivity, we're going to be, giving of themselves to the global South. But the global South was going to essentially teach the global North how to be more loving and human. I guess that's sort of the sum up of this radio interview. And it's only 20 minutes. It's on my YouTube channel. And I totally encourage folks to check it out because it's very short and punchy, and she lays out so many keywords. So later in this live, I'm gonna play certain sections, and I'm gonna talk about how it all fits together. But definitely take time to spend on this. And my husband's getting home from work, so you're gonna just hear a little bit of noise with the bike. Hi, I'm doing a live, but it's fine. So anyway, so I actually made notes, and again, thanks Roel for teaching me that this is something you could do. I hadn't done this before, but these are the various timestamps. They're in the description of the blog that I have, so you can click through, but it was a way for me to keep notes of all these things she said in the 20 minutes, many of which were very telling. It seems like they definitely had a handle on what the larger rollout was going to be at least 60 years in advance. And, I wanted to bring this up too, because I think we don't know the history. We really don't, or we know some history. We know stories that were told, but they're often incredibly incomplete and skewed. And so as we're moving back into this new space of decolonizing everything being decolonized, like Raul's investigation of what happened in Nigeria and the ways in which their decolonization was managed to the benefit of the global north, managed thus that like all of the people were played off against each other. There was no really way for the Nigerians to win. They were put in impossible situations, and so you can, yes, on paper decolonize, but if the reality is that you're still subject to these outside pressures, economic pressures, geopolitical pressures around, weapons and, control of food access and all of these things, like what does it actually mean to decolonize? And I think this is a paper that was written by someone in Nigeria about both the decolonization and then the prolonged and intentional underdevelopment of Africa through the remaining part of the 20th century into the 21st century, and the implications of that for Nigerians themselves. Because we have to understand the whole construct of this beneficence of social impact finance isn't that, right? It really is about liquidity and global capital. So, and I think one of the things that led Raul to writing on this, there was an announcement by, it actually used to be called, I believe, the Colonial Development Corporation, the CDC group, and it was created, I think, around 1960, but it was a subunit of the UK Development Finance Aid, and that dated back to 1948, so that's just post-war. But it was a way of setting up international banking systems, and the fact that this recently shifted their name from the CDC group to the British International Investment is notable, right? And they're branding themselves as productive, sustainable, and inclusive. And this is sort of their strategy report. But you can see, again, huge amounts of these solar panels over open ground. And Jason and I we're planning a trip to California, and I'll fly into Las Vegas, but I had someone reach out to me who was really struggling with this issue of solar panels in the desert, in the Nevada desert, and the fact that those are really fragile ecosystems. And I think people often sort of imagine like, oh, we'll just throw some stuff out there and catch some sun. But actually, you can tell from this image, there's a lot of environmental impact on this intervention, on putting, both water, the habitat, the animals, the insects. There's impact. It's not that this is only a good thing, that having all of these solar panels splayed off across the grasslands there. So that was another piece of why Raul wrote his piece. The head of this new group, or the renamed group, is Nick O'Donohoe. Nick O'Donohoe is a key player. I had my eye on him for a while. He is connected to Ronald Cohen, came out of Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, was with the Global Impact Investment Initiative, Big Society Capital, and even this is a recent tweet that they were doing specific investment in Africa. This is July, so they have specific investment funds. And I mean, this should come as no surprise to anyone, because we know that what's coming is that this smart, sustainable future that they're building is largely built on the mineral resources of the African continent. And also not just the mineral resources, but in the human capital finance space, they're actually depending on using finclusion and ed tech to turn especially the youth of both Africa and India into impact commodities once they get them on blockchain. So, this is resource infrastructure that's being put in place now. And, again, oil is central, extractivism. At the time that the Civil War unfolded, Dutch Shell was among a number of oil interests. I think they were the most prominent. And, the oil companies were underreporting, their for tax purposes to the Nigerian government. So the local people, despite having this vast amount of oil in their vicinity, it was like the black curse, this oil curse, that they weren't actually benefiting from it, that they weren't getting the money, but there were terrible environmental consequences around oil spills and oil pipelines, and long-term consequences. So again, even it's still playing out. This is a 2021 article that Shell is still paying out hundreds of millions of dollars for the harm that was caused. And this is just an article, I'll include the links in the bottom with the source if you want to look it up. But, it's talking about the oil boom. And this is 64, 65, so just a couple years before the Civil War itself started. And it's that geography. It's both the cultural divisions of those three parts of Nigeria, and then the fact that the oil is, and later worked for Andreessen Horowitz. And so this new book is essentially talking about new forms of social governance, I think, essentially like new forms of conquest without actually taking over land initially. That you build online community and network systems that are geographically diffuse, and then you build off of that to have people meet in person and then build in physical locations like various infrastructure. But it's very much based on a mixed reality premise. And, later on when we look at Barbara Ward's books, her presentation has been about the small planet, the spaceship Earth, we all have to share. It's this sort of cybernetic vision, which again is mirrored in the cover of this book. And if you followed my work around the noosphere, me looking into it and what Teilhard Desjardins and Vernadsky were doing about this idea of the ideas floating around, and then also of the World Sensorium books. Let me see. I don't have those right to hand, but about the world sensorium and the creation through polarization, this yin-yang, the kundalini energy into this new evolutionary state that is more ephemeral, like etheric ideas, like this common hive mind system. You can see how this is all playing out also within the context of biophysics and the radioeugenics. So you've got the currency transactions, which aren't, as we know, really so much about money as we understand it, as about making transactions visible to the machine. You have the yin yang, polarization energy, and then you have the man figure. And so I think this book is really important. It's saved as a PDF, and I encourage people to look through it. It's only 262 pages, so you can kind of scan it fairly quickly. But, they've decided it's not just about seasteading or going out into outer space. We're literally going to create decentralized networks. And knowing the role that the Catholic Church played in the food system distribution in Nigeria, and the role in the social justice space, and the biotech space that's coming. When you think about the network state, often Roll talks about sort of the Catholic Church as being like this very early network of state intelligence, right? Like through very diffuse communities that had trusted authorities that shared confidential information, through confessionals or whatever. Like the Catholic Church had this diffuse network already, and then it was glommed on later, mirrored by various, global, national, and multinational intelligence systems. And now it feels like Bitcoin is the next stage up. So, okay, so I'm going to play this first one. This is about the concept of borders and nations. And again, so this is from the 1960 interview with Barbara Ward and Studs Terkel. And I think it was done in Chicago. And the reason behind this interview was ostensibly she was pitching the creation of this Adelaide Stevenson International Institute. Now, Adelaide Stevenson was... he was born in Bloomington, Indiana, I think, but he served as the governor of Illinois. He served in many federal administrative roles. He played an administrative role under the Secretary of State in the creation of the United Nations. And evidently, I haven't dug into it too deeply, but had a very important speech around the Cuban Missile Crisis given to the UN. So this idea that they were going to create an institute in the greater Chicago area to bring all of these thought leaders together and to have conversations, but these were going to be public, not private. And in this, she specifically mentions not only Bilderberg, that this was going to be counter to the secrecy of Bilderberg, but also the Pugwash conferences. And if you haven't looked into the Pugwash conferences, I really encourage it. I was a bit shocked that she would bring that up because, at least today, very few people know the Pugwash conferences are still going on, but they were happening during the Cold War to develop sort of geopolitical strategy around atoms for peace and nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War. Both sides were coming together in these Pugwash conferences. So she's pitching the Stevenson Institute as a public-facing version to essentially sell them on this new idea. And in the clip I'm going to play, she mentions the idea of moving beyond borders and that we all have solidarity with one another, which, again, I'm not against this. I'm not coming at this from a nationalist perspective, because clearly the metaverse is a global project. It's a global problem. And I do think we need to meet it with some form of solidarity, but not with the digital pass, not with the biometric digital pass, like not that sort of removal of borders. The change that's going to be happening is that the borders are going to be on demand, real time, personalized, and the idea of your national border is just going to go away, and capital will just flow wherever capital needs to flow through these DAOs. So I'm going to just play this.
Then we have nations and we have borders.
Well, I think we've got to reduce them. The concept of the frontier, the concept of the border, ought to be no more than Cook County. In other words, you always have some devolution of function. You go from national government to the state level, to the city level, to the ward level, and at the basic level of all, you've got the family. In other words, we're perfectly used to living at different levels of organization with different functions. But heavens, when we get to the question of our planetary society, suddenly we have nothing. I've described it as a sort of enormous physical giant with not even a pinhead at the top. And I think that is the danger of our finally exploding the whole system. Because one thing you can't do, you cannot live close together in a society which is not much bigger than a village and have no organs of authority, no organs of police, no organs of justice, and above all, no genuine long-term policy of solidarity.
You use the phrase planetary society and a world no bigger than a village, and the lack of this feeling of solidarity.
All right. So I don't know if you guys can see this when I'm holding it. So the World Sensorium essentially lays all of this out. Also, Julian Huxley's Manifesto for the creation of Unesco. And so those were happening in the just post-World War period, the 1946, 47, 48. So I'm sure that Barbara was positioned for this, and so she was very much aware of this languaging around the village. It all seems so accessible. Solidarity, doing unto others, but very much within a limited resource constraint, Malthusian sort of population control constraint. So in the networked state book, this is one of the pages, and they're talking about systems, reproducible systems and non-reproducible systems, and using technology to figure out how to make systems more reproducible. And in this, he's saying that the markets are not terribly reproducible because people get wise to what you're doing and then they change their strategies. So I'll say he compares it to trying to figure out how to get a drone to work. And if the drone, something wrong happens to it, you just start over and you do it again until you get it to work. But in a financial market, things change because people are human. So, but what their goal is to have enough data. And here he describes it as if we have good enough measurements on the past, we have a better prediction of the future in an extremely literal sense. And so I think we have to understand like the architecture of all of the smart city, digital money, nanobots, everything being turned into a cyber-physical system and a computable system is about claiming the past and documenting it at such a granular level that you can predict the future and possibly even shape the future if you can link the past outcomes to the physical environment and what happens in it. You can make certain outcomes more likely to happen than others. And so, they were talking about the importance of history and saying, well, we just don't even know because, in the past, history was, they always say it's written by the winners. History is selective. There's a lot of history we don't know. I didn't know anything about the Nigerian Civil War until, Raoul put in 2 weeks of his time to sort of lay it out in a way that was understandable, right? And that was relatable to work that I was doing. But you need an armature for that. You need an armature for the history. And a lot of times we just do shorthand history. We just do short versions of, like, they're just sort of memes. Like, we don't actually really think about it. We've internalized the stories that we've been brought up in. And it's just shorthand. We don't actually interrogate what they are. And I'm saying, like, now is the time we actually really have to interrogate the history, because the people who want to put this all on blockchain, they understand the power of narrative and information management and knowledge management, and they're after that. So in this book, I just want to read a quote. He says, conversely, the more uncertainty about your past, the more confused you are about where you've come from and where you're going, the more likely your rocket will crash. It's Orwell more literally than he ever expected. He who controls the past controls the future, in the direct sense that he has better control theory. Only a civilization with a strong capacity for accurate micro-history could ever make it to the moon. And he closes, it says, a group of people who doesn't know who they are or where they came from won't ever make it to the moon, let alone to Mars. And, and if you haven't seen it yet, actually I don't have a link to it here, but Lincoln Cannon, he has actually a whole talk from, I don't know, maybe 2016 about raising the dead and the idea of sort of information theory and creating, I think essentially what it would be like digital twins or digital mind files, and to use these technologies and knowledge of the past to create some sort of, longevity or reincarnation based on data. But I wanted to take this moment to say, clearly, if you follow my work, you understand that I'm always trying to pick through the history and the stories. And there's so much I don't know. Like, I'm not here to tell you I'm any authority, but I'm reading widely. The current one I'm reading, which is like perfect for Barbara Ward and her Quaker Dad, is this Quakernomics book. But I'm trying to figure out the history because I think it actually very much relates. And I think the people in power have enough money to buy historians and behavioral psychologists and all these people to look back at the history and figure out how to use it in ways that will nudge us to the outcome that they most want. And that may not be the outcome that we want. So for me, the history really matters. And, I was listening to a talk earlier this week by someone, and I know they know my work, and I don't know that this was directed at me in any way, but like their angle was, we all know what's the matter. Therefore, we should all join together, even if we have differences about certain things. And what I would say is, I don't think we actually at this point in the resistance have the same understanding of what is the matter, right? Like if you think that having a programmable money system that's going to keep you safe from off of fiat currency is that's the thing that's the matter, it's the fiat currency, but it's not the beautiful programmable money that Charles Eisenstein would like to sell you. Like, that's a very fundamental disconnect. Like, we're not on the same path. Like, if I pursue my goals, which is not to have programmable money, it actually is going to affect you. And so we have to, I think it's really important to get clear. And I think understanding the history and trying to sort of sift through these shortcuts, these mental shortcuts that allow people to put us in boxes it's hard work. It's uncomfortable work. It's hard knowing. Like, I will admit, when I started interrogating some of these histories, I was like really sad for about 8 months, because not only did I realize the thing that I thought was going to fix the problem, which at the time I thought was data collection in public schools, which is like laughable now. Not only did I realize that wasn't going to help, but that there was a whole lot of unpacking of things to do, that like I was going to have to put in a lot of work to even get to the point where I could start to understand what was going on. And that's not easy. And a lot of people, like, for whatever reason, you don't have time, you don't have the emotional strength, you don't do it. People are just not doing it. And I think that's what they count on. And, am I saying if you do that, there's definitely going to be a resolution? I'm not. Like, I don't know how this is all going to play out, but I think a lot of us understand that there is a spiritual component here. And I would say, if you're somebody of faith, you actually, like, and you're actually walking the good road, right? Like, you're walking the right road. We need to suss out the ways in which harmful practices manifested themselves throughout our histories and our relationship to those, and then try to address them moving forward. Not to just embrace shortcut histories like identity politics histories and then just get in these little boxes so we can be slotted around and moved around on the chessboard. I think that's really important. So after I read Roll's wonderful article and I did some deep dive into Barbara Ward, I do try to keep up with some people who I think are maybe they're not currently part of the circle of people doing work, but at one point they were understanding what was going on with impact finance. And so, I found actually a talk that that Julianne Romanello did in Tulsa within the past week. And, I was curious how she was presenting the story because, I actually came to Tulsa in January of 2020 to talk about all of this from an education context because she was trying to navigate what was happening at Tulsa University with the takeover and the gutting of humanities there and really the conversion of that school into a school that would suit the needs of the intelligent state to build the metaverse, really. Although we didn't fully realize how short the time frame was on all of that. And that was like late January of 2020. And I have to say, the presentation that was given, and it was short, I'm very long form. I get that. There's a lot to say, and you have to sort of be selective about how much you can say in a certain amount of time. And this talk was just maybe an hour and a half. But it was kind of like, for the most part, an Agenda 21 talk. Like, it was smart cities, it was World Economic Forum. It was the kind of talk that dozens of related people in the resistance could have given that exact same talk. There was a lot of new information. She did mention social impact finance once or twice. But what kind of got to me, in contrast to the work that Raul is doing with this history of like surfacing where it came from and then what it looks like now, is that like a lot of it was essentially framed as like this was just about woke culture trying to do re-education on people in corporate workforce training, kind of. Like, this was about controlling middle-class people and making them do things that they didn't want to do. There was, and I know because we had deep exchanges about the United Way and what was happening with CAP Tulsa and this 2-generation impact investing program in Tulsa. But just like the issue with the United Way was that it was taking corporate people's time away that they could be more productive at work and sending them to United Way rather than they were actually developing data dashboards to turn the working poor, ALICE, the assets limited income constrained poor, employed, the working poor into these data assets. And that's hard. Like, it's hard to have had connections with people and we're being on the same page and then realize we're no longer on the same page. I mean, I don't feel like my page has really changed. Like, my net has gone wider and I've gone deeper. But we have to get clear about what this is, because if you're of a mind that, and this is again coming from Tulsa, coming from former Indian territory. This was an area that displaced indigenous people were all sent off of their own lands to this undesirable location until one day, as it became closed in, the frontier closed up, then and they found oil, then it became desirable, right? And then you could just simply forget all of the agreements that were made and then hand it over to the other people. And so what I was trying to say in the comments of this talk was that these smart cities are Indian reservations. Like, the Constitution is just going to be the latest broken treaty. And until we can get to the point of understanding that, and I'm not saying that just from like I'm a lecture finger wagging person, but like literally that is the logic. The logic of these markets is that they claim things that don't belong to them and they use them up until it's all used up, and then they look for the next thing to claim. And certain people are given certain privileges for a certain amount of time, but eventually this AI system, like the world brain system that is coming, is it wants all of us. It wants all of our data. It wants us all in smart cities, not because the leftists want to re-educate corporate citizens. Like, it's not like someone's making Goldman Sachs or BlackRock do this. No, Goldman Sachs and BlackRock cooked all of this up. So I'm not saying that's not annoying and troubling, but we actually have to get at this deeper picture, which is the colonization project. And and where the United States fits into the colonization project. And there's like a really good book by Daniel Immerwahr called How to Hide an Empire, about US and empire and territories and the stories we tell ourselves and that we don't tell ourselves. And it's really, really important. So like this story, I'm linking Tulsa, like this was the trajectory of my day. It was like read Rowell's wonderful piece, get really interested in Barbara Ward, look at this fascinating 20-minute interview, and then like come across this talk, which again, I'm not trying to like, it is not just her. Like she is just standing in for any one of 100 people who could give that same talk. And I guess I'm asking people to like step into a different space. And not everybody's going to be able to do it. But I'm saying it actually matters to make these linkages. And from the human standpoint, like from our humanity standpoint. And really it's going to affect our strategy, because if we don't understand it as a colonizing project, like we're not going to understand nanotechnology colonizing our bodies. We're not going to understand, radiation in all of the soil and tracking like soil-based communication with nanotech so that it can be an economy. It can be some free market economy so that the AI can read it. And that was the other piece that was left out. And again, it was only an hour, so I'm not trying to throw too much shade. And I invite you, like I'll have the picture of the talk and the link. Listen to it and see the frame and think about it. Think about if that is the frame that's going to bring people together around the world. Is the frame those people out there are doing something to us, the patriots of the US, to make us do things we don't want to do, and therefore we should really defend these corporate interests that are bringing this on, like, and free them from ESG impact investing so that they don't have to be woke and they can just simply pursue their biotechnology, debt finance, militarism projects. Like, is that it? Because these aren't mom and pop stores that we're defending at this point. These are giant BMS that have been generations in the making. So anyway, that's my Oklahoma land rush. I feel like the context is important. There, like you can see the dispossession. That's why the piece that I was trying to write about the refugees is like the original people of the United States were the refugees. Like we created the refugees like in our own lands, and then we manipulated that to claim land for progress and development, and then later we reclaimed it again when there was oil there. And so we really have to grapple with what is progress and what is imposed progress, because the next version of progress is going to be life plus, right? Cyber physical panopticon, so that we can program you to some outcome that we've decided. And we're going to call this good, and we're going to call it sustainable. So this is the talk. Again, it is about smartness. Ultimately, we do need to take it beyond surveillance and understand that this is about machine learning, and that the impact tokenization of our exchanges in that smart city environment are going to be to attempt to trigger generalized artificial intelligence and digital twinning. So if folks are out there at this point and they're not talking about digital twinning, and they're not talking about the link of all of that to defense simulations and the work of the Department of Energy for years, like this didn't just happen. None of this just happened. This is what I'm saying is like this goes back at least to the late 19th century, if not like leapfrogging back to the Roman Empire. But within our current understanding, this is something that happened with the buildup of the richest people, the robber barons, and this is the clear result that comes after that. So we have to take the data collection to that next step, which is the machine learning and the cybernetic feedback loops. Again, it's not just that they're trying to boss us around, it is that they are literally trying to govern us in a cybernetic space and polarize us. So to keep us divided, to keep us in boxes, to manage us on this game board. And so the other thing about Tulsa that I'll just mention is that, the race riots were really big. When I went there, we went down to Black Wall Street. And again, Bloomberg's hands are all over that. So that's all, it's complicated. There's people who have been very traumatized and taken advantage of. And people have been brought through the process, brought through academia, and taught how to be a part of this machine. But a lecture that was really important for me, and something that I think is really vital, a concept for people to understand, is something called hypothecation. And this talk is from 2013, so my goodness, it's like again, almost 10 years, but it's by Calvin Schermerhorn, and he talks about his really in-depth analysis of studying the life of an enslaved man who was relocated from the tobacco fields of Maryland, the Chesapeake, to the sugar plantations in New Orleans. And so part of the work that he did was looking into the financial transactions. And it's not sexy. Like, understanding how finance works, especially historic finance, it's hard to get excited about it, but that's the nuts and bolts. And so what those transactions, and this gentleman that he documented was just one of, hundreds of thousands of families that were moved, that the currency wasn't all the same. The states that, had different exchanges, and it was paper, these mortgages. And so trusted third parties in New York generally would hold the paper while the property was being moved from the Chesapeake to the Deep South. And then later what came in the 1840s, I think, 40s and 50s, is they created a Bank of Louisiana, because the sugar plantations, it wasn't enough simply to create the commodity, but they wanted to industrialize, right, and do their own refining so that they didn't have to just export, but they needed money to do that. And so they mortgaged the enslaved people that they controlled. And so the way hypothecation worked was that you could mortgage your enslaved people and essentially get double the value. So you didn't actually, when you mortgaged them, put the enslaved person somewhere else that you didn't have access. You continue to have access to their labor on your plantation, while you also had access to the money drawn out of against their value to build these refineries, to build these sugar refineries. And that paper that was going through the Bank of Louisiana was recycled through England. And a lot of the folks in England, and this is again where it ties back into the work that Raul's doing and the work that I want to do in more detail about the Quakers, is that, like, by making human suffering abstract and making these values attached to random bits of paper that had values on them, they could separate out the trauma of what was happening and distance themselves from it. So by the time the paper got to England, and a lot of it was in Bristol and Liverpool, these were people who were Quakers, who were supposed to be pacifists and abolitionists, but like the Barclay Bank, they had no problem processing all of these paperworks that were attached to human bondage. They didn't. And then eventually they would repackage them and sell them back into New York, and then the New York liberals would buy them too, because nobody really wanted to know. Nobody wanted to understand what hypothecation was. Nobody really wanted to understand what was going on. There was no incentive to actually understand how grotesque it was, and that's why it kept going on and on. And what he says, because someone asked in the audience, one of the first questions, they said, well, Calvin, like, did the U.S. abolitionists not know what was happening? And essentially what he said was, the story that the U.S. abolitionists told themselves was that this was a situation of like one-off evil slave masters, and that it wasn't structural. Like, they didn't want to tell themselves the story that it was structural, because then they'd actually have to interrogate their own operation in the system. And they didn't want to do that. They just wanted to operate as though, it was just some bad apples out there, beating their slaves, but the whole system wasn't rotten, which the whole system clearly was rotten. And I feel like the tokenization that is happening, and the use of social impact finance, and the use of what so many out there are calling the Chinese social credit score, it really dates back to the slave logs of affirming the value of enslaved people for productive physical labor or reproductive labor, which is even worse. Like, after it's all bad. But they would value their slaves. They had values based on the jobs that they were supposed to do. And so, yeah, like the Chinese social credit score thing is kind of a red herring, unless, like, if you're dealing with both of them, I'm willing to certainly entertain both sides. But if you're not dealing with the hypothecation aspect and the enslavement aspect, I don't think you're doing the work, at least in the United States, because you've missed the story. You're out and you're in the wrong story. So again, going back to the Vatican, in my piece that I wrote, there was a significant involvement of the Jesuits. The Jesuits are very much involved in social impact finance here in the United States. Many Jesuit-affiliated universities are pushing pilots of Pay for Success, Santa Clara University, Georgetown, Gonzaga, Fordham. A lot of those are coming, and they have this history. The history is tied to slave mortgages, right? And so how is it that the story that we're telling now around the resistance doesn't center this part of the story? Because to me, I feel like that's where we're at. Like, we actually have to come to terms with the past to figure out the way through. And then papering that over or pretending that didn't happen and that really we've always been good and it's someone coming after the US because we're exceptional. And we're so wonderful that, of course, they want to bring us down because we're the only people that are doing it right. That's not, I don't think that's accurate. Like, I don't think that if we're really truthful with ourselves, we would understand that that's what's happening. So this is just a slide linking Barclays Bank and its Quaker roots. But I'm about 100 pages into this. It's fascinating. The Quakers, actually it's open to the Barclays Bank page. But there are sections about, and these are all liberal, good people, right? Pacifists. Good. They made clocks and they made pharmaceuticals and they launched the Industrial Revolution with steel, Abraham Darby and the Iron Bridge and pig iron. And so they were highly ingenious, right? But I think sort of like going back to the talk that Julianne gave that was really shielding corporate America from this like supposed sort of tide, it felt like, of wokeness. Although, I mean, she did mention a couple times like, oh, the right has this too, but she didn't really mention how. She didn't mention Peter Thiel and Palantir and the fact that, there were people who left TU who went to join this new, classical university that's being funded by, Palantir. How that all works out, I just don't even understand. But anyway, moving along. This is a really good paper. Xenia Kish, at least at one time, she was based in Tulsa. I didn't get to meet her. It's interesting when we kind of knew each other on Facebook, but she didn't come when I gave my talk, which is interesting. And Justin Leroy, so I really thank him for the work that he did on social impact finance as essentially the afterlife of slavery. This is really key, and the talk that he gave at the Whitney about social impact bonds is central. Like, this is it, and again, it's part of this larger conversation around Africa and around the faith communities and around colonization. So in the hypothecation that's coming in this new version of the digital twin version, it's going to be based on your data analytics, right? Instead of getting you up on a pedestal and looking at your teeth and looking at your muscles and looking at your breasts or whatever, like for the work that was that work, this new work is going to be, what is your brain, what is your compliance, what are your badges? And this has to come through the ed tech space, right? And so the thing is, the CDC group in the UK Finance and Investment, they were connected with the World Bank SABRE program and EdTech in very, very deep ways. And so it's not just about that. I mean, the story they'll tell is that they need more effective education to bridge the gap, but at the same time, UNICEF is backing this Emizi 3D virtual reality program targeted in Nigeria specifically. And when they talked about it, they said the initial plan was that children would learn to code with gestures. And they literally have said, those children will never get real teachers or real schools, but we'll give them the emerging technology, right? We'll give them the virtual reality headsets. And this is not the only deployment in Africa, but this is one in Nigeria. And we'll set it up as private education. Right. Well, and this is very much linked to Brookings Institution, the school choice, the digital vouchers, Bridges International Academy. And this is where the free market comes in, right? And so if we're protecting all these corporate interests, these are the corporate interests that are looking to data mine children. These are all companies. Like, these are people who are out to make money by data mining children. And then they're actually creating the data that's enabling the financial markets to bet on the children and, underwriting the devices with the sensor networks to spy on the children and to create the digital twins. So all of this is capital, right? All of this is the new version of how we have built our global economy, is as a digital panopticon. And like, would they call this the ethical capitalism? Like, these people would call gestural coding for Nigerian children in VR headsets ethical capitalism, because that's the history and that's how it goes together. But anyway, back to Roll's piece a bit. I just want to touch on this just to orient you. This is the map, the port area that was blockaded. Again, mass starvation. Lots of celebrities. So again, these early fundraisers. I remember as a kid, like hearing. I didn't really know it at the time, but you have these visual impressions of starving children. Now, I'm not including any images of those because I find that they feel predatory to use those images of the children in that way, but I think you can use your imagination, like distended stomachs, children starving to death. And this was done under the watch of the West. And again, they were providing airlifted food supplies, but they were also enabling this occupation, the conflict to go on for years longer, so, to cause this great harm so that they could come in and provide the solution, which is what I always say with pay for success finance. You create the trauma, you create the harm, you level things to the ground so that you can come in and any little scrap or crumb you provide looks like an improvement. So, and this is just an article, so in lieu of including the children, it is starvation as a means of warfare. And I do know that that's something that the resistance talks about a lot, about the supply chains and the food. But again, I wish sometimes it was more situated within understanding mass dislocation. Like the starvations didn't just happen in Russia or China. Literally, like we were starving people out on this continent by relocating, the original people of the Americas into reservation systems and then promising rations and then not delivering them. And then when, the men would fight back to try to take care of their families, like they were executed or, made to be outlaws because they were simply trying to survive. So food control is very central. And again, that's a big, big blockchain project, is the food supply system. And if you look in my piece that I did on refugees, I'd be very interested in any feedback people want to offer, because I did a comparison of this Acton Academy is one of these franchise charter schools, not charter, but it's a micro school that's led by Jeff and Laura Sandifer, who are, Texas oil folks. It's very much framed as free market and religious. Although I don't know that the education is religious, but they come from that frame. Jeff is affiliated with Acton Institute, which is very much a free market, religious-oriented think tank connected with the Catholic Church. And Acton Institute, and it's backed by people connected to the Birch Society and the Koch brothers and various things. That has all their own baggage. I'm not saying it's just the right, but in this case, they created a documentary called Poverty Inc. And in this Poverty Inc., one of the producers, he actually was a graduate student at MIT working with Brian Ford, who was working in the Digital Currency Initiative. This was back in 2016. And he developed a platform for commodities called lowercase b underline verify, B verify. And it was about tracking through Internet of Things sensors commodities. And they wanted the commodities, they would imagine them as corn or something. This was with the government of Mexico, and I've talked a lot about the conditional cash transfers there. But I compared the language that he used about this B verify platform on blockchain and commodities monitoring and quality monitoring to what was said in an open letter by a mother who was a parent whose children were at an Acton Academy school. Because in that way, the children were also commodities being managed on dashboards, which at the time I don't think were blockchained yet, but we're not far off of that. And when she tried to make inquiries of the Sandifers, they really pretty much just said, well, if you don't like it, you can leave, which is, that's how the markets work, right? Like these people were not into the customer is always right. They were just like, if you don't trust us, then you should just leave, which they did. But I think understanding food commodities and people as commodities is important. So, again, I guess now that I'm going to be moving into talking about the interview. I'm going to go back to the interview and give sort of a breakout. I'm going to take a break and just look and see if how you guys are doing. People are there. Okay, good. All right, thank you for being there. I've never done this before, so I just want to make sure that there's still folks out there. So I'm going to break out this 20-minute interview with things that I thought were really interesting. And I will say the beginning of it is quite telling. Now, there's so many little bits, and they don't go into it in detail, but it's just like the words that they use. He opens with this being a nuclear age. Now, we know through the discussions about the world sensorium and the world brain that like radiogenics, that, you know, Fritz Kunst, Julia Stolman, Oliver Reiser, the Foundation for Integrated Education, like they were really interested in giving us a little nudge through managed radiation. And you know, I've connected with Jen Lake, and her blog is Polio Forever. And then I think she actually might have another blog that's Jennifer Lake at WordPress. And so she spent probably 15 or more years really looking into what was happening in the Cold War with the nuclear tests, the radioactive isotopes, the role of the Atomic Energy Commission, the role of a related corporate infrastructure. Because Alexander Sachs, and I mentioned this before, like when he gave the Einstein-Szilard letter to FDR to launch the Manhattan Project, defense was really one of three things. It also included energy and health. So the health angle was something that they had been very interested in using radiation to create this triggering this evolution 2.0 noetic hive mind consciousness for a very long time. So the fact that the interview starts off within the context of the nuclear age, the atomic age, I think is really compelling. And so I would encourage, Jen has tons of information on her blog that I just wanted to make sure that I could link to it and you could check it out. So I'm gonna just play this.
At the same time, that very act has made a new form of energy possible too, nuclear fuel. The age perhaps the most exciting man's ever known, some would say, the most terrifying yet most challenging. And I think one of the most perceptive observers of the scene is the British economist sociologist lady Barbara Ward Jackson.
Okay, so you can kind of hear what he just said there about the power. And okay, let me see. Okay, and I'm going to go on to this transmutation. So then this is the next one.
That we need is simply to extend to humanity what we feel for our values aren't bad, but the trouble is the moment they get to a frontier, they all stop dead. So the transmutation that we need is simply to extend to humanity what we feel for our nation. I mean, that's it.
So then we come.
So again, this sort of builds on the border element, you know, that we're all one, we all have solidarity, but the transmutation that we need. And so this to me brings up the Moonshot Project, clearly. And I was going back to try to find the paper, the link to the paper that I normally use, and I found a different source. And this one actually is talking about cybernetic avatar life. And I'm just gonna read it. It says, this is from the Japan Science and Technology Agency. So that Moonshot Goal 1 is that by 2050, we live outside of a mind and body in time and space. So this is from a report, and I think this whole project launched in December 2019. For cybernetic avatar life, we must first develop technologies that can augment physical, cognitive, and perceptual abilities for specific tasks, and then later technologies that can augment physical, cognitive, and perceptual abilities to the top level. As a starting step, the goal in 2030 is to develop technologies that can augment physical, cognitive, and perceptual abilities for specific tasks. And so if you look in the little blue ovals, by 2030, it says that like one human could manage 10 avatars doing a single task. And that's the goal, is that one person could do it, like operate 10 times. So this is the scientific management and Taylorism. And it's interesting because when you hear people talk about it, they're always saying like, oh, one person could operate 10 robots in 10 different Walmarts. And they're always using 10. So then a decade out, they're saying one person could manage over 100 avatars. And then the next one up, it says one person could manage over 1,000 avatars by 2050. And so to me, like, this is just this ridiculous, and actually Friedrich Taylor's family, I think they were Quaker too. And so it's this scientific management process. And like, this is the imperative of perpetual growth. And, you know, I don't have an easy pat answer. Like, I don't espouse any of the other current options out there, but I know if the imposition of capital and growth means that by 2050, whatever constitutes a person has to be operating 1,000 avatars, Like, that's insanity. And I keep thinking that if we could just go back and reflect on some of this history of like, what did we get rid of? Like, what were those values of reciprocity or connectivity with locality and family and spiritual practice that we tried to wipe off the planet so that we could substitute this instead? This is why I think I just keep hoping more people want to spend more time exploring that story than the Agenda 21 technocracy, they're coming after America story. And everybody's entitled to live in the story that they want to live. Like, I get it, but hopefully we can create space for people to spend some other time. So just so you know, Barbara Ward, I make these giant maps, and they're messy. They're not graphically very pretty. But by the process of adding all of the dots, it really helps cement it for me. And so I was going through last night, like, okay, add Barbara Ward to the outer layer. And, who was she? Well, besides, going to the Sorbonne, she spent a decade at Harvard. She spent not quite a decade, I think 7 years at Columbia. So she was the guest, right, in being, indoctrinating and being indoctrinated about the policies. In 1966, she wrote a book, Spaceship Earth, The Planet as a Small Village. And that sounds really cute because nobody wants to be against a village, right? And then she had later, like, Only One Earth, the Care and Maintenance of a Small Planet, and The Origins of Sustainable Development. Like, that's the biography about her. So the framing is about the small planet. She was an advisor to Kennedy and Johnson, okay? One of her closest friends was Robert Mcnamara. Now, I had heard of Robert Mcnamara a while back, but like when I was refreshing myself on his bio, it's kind of amazing. I think he actually was born in California and started out at Berkeley, and then ended up joining, his background was in systems management. I think computing and systems management and gaming, like simulation gaming, that was his expertise. And so he was part of a cohort of people that went into Ford, the Ford company, and sort of remade it all based on data analytics and statistics and algorithms and efficiencies. And they called them the whiz kids. And so he went from Ford, then Kennedy invited him. I'm trying to remember what it was. Like he could be Secretary of the Treasury or head of the Defense Department. And he chose the Defense Department. And essentially he had some pretty egregious policies in Vietnam, and many people died, and very interested in very high level technology, weaponry, and the war gaming and simulation aspect was very much a part of that. So, and then after the Vietnam War, he became head of the World Bank. And so if you see this trajectory of like organizational management theory, systems theory, and I would just say, I was talking with someone the other day, and I don't have a slide of this, but this guy, Herbert Simon, he's a systems theorist who is doing all sorts of work. He spent 50 years at Carnegie Mellon doing organizational theory as it relates to AI. And I think so much of what's going on now with tokenized governance, impact tokens, soulbound tokens, it's very much about systems engineering and making the systems visible to the algorithms for the processing. So the fact that it goes from this overall corporate systems engineering factor into, a war not on just on people, because like a lot of the stuff, like it was a war on natural life, the Agent Orange, the dropping, the stuff that was happening, the trial of Internet of Things in the forest, sensor networks, the crazy intense amounts of psychological warfare research and development that went along with that. And like, again, that's a key part of the story. If we're not telling the story of how the research and development that came out of the Defense Department is embedded in the metaverse, is embedded in psychological warfare against domestic populations, like we're missing it. Like we've missed the story. If that's not part of the story, like you're not ever going to come to some good strategy, because you don't know who we are. Like you don't actually understand who you're up against if you don't understand Tavistock and systems theory and behavior management, and that it's homegrown. Like it's literally homegrown at the most elite levels. And I did a live about B.F. Skinner the other day that touched on that. So her connection to Mcnamara was very big. Morris Strong helped set up the summit in Stockholm in 1972. He was an oil guy. So that's the thing that's really important to understand about these sustainability networks, is that like she later joined and led an organization called the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED. It was started by this guy, Robert Anderson, who was the founder of Arco Oil and helped create that, like spearhead the Alaska pipeline. Morris Strong, who was the sustainability guy, he was also a Canadian oilman involved in like hydropower and development of radioactive materials and controlling. He literally wanted to sell like like Colorado aquifer and just export it to some other state. These people who are behind the sustainability movement are not sustainable. Like in they're frauds. They're little frauds, and they're telling you a nice story. They're telling you stories about villages and tiny planets, and that we'll all be nice to each other. And meanwhile, literally they're planning war and like gaslighting you and installing sensor networks to control you in the panopticon and saying that it's for your own good. But this is all us. So anyway, so that's sort of the background of who Barbara is, just so you have. She had the support of Indira Gandhi. So again, it's not just Africa that these systems are going after. India is very central too. And again, Walter Ward, her father, who is the Quaker, and Teresa Berg, who is Catholic. And Barbara Ward was a major influence in the Vatican II and the pivot towards social justice of the Catholic, which was about impact investing. So this is just an article. I think Raoul had linked to this in his feature. He mentioned in the article that there was a dinner party with the former head of the UK Ministry of Education, and this woman, Ward, was very influenced by Chester Attlee, who was elected by sort of the working class and the Labour Party after the Second World War, and held sway in really implementing sort of this Fabian program. And so that's really important because Attlee also was a major influence on the Mondragon cooperative development that the priest that led the Mondragon cooperatives. So that's an important linkage there. And at this dinner party where Mcnamara was appointed to be part of this International Development Committee, which is, again, using the decolonization construct and the pulling out as a way of creating new infrastructure for development aid that also led to really crippling debt finance, right? Like that's what the IMF and the World Bank were specialized in, was quote unquote development that will like take out your kneecaps. In the guise of development, saddling them with all this debt. But at the dinner party with the Minister of Education, like we have to understand that like probably this ed tech stuff was all bubbling along at the time. Like they all knew this was coming. Michael Young was a leader in the UK Labour Party at the time, and he wrote sort of the manifesto for Attlee, and it's all Fabianism, pretty much. And I wanted it to be good. Like, I used to be on the left, and I wanted those things to be right, but they're not in it for the right reasons. They're not in it for the right reasons at all. And Michael Young later was he was the father of social entrepreneurship in the UK. He predates Ronald Cohen, and he was very involved in correspondence education on television, and the open university, and distance education through digital technology. And his anchor hold was in South Africa. And again, that's sort of where this peer-to-peer university came out of, and then eventually glommed on with the blockchain block certs learning machine certificates, is that model that like melded with MIT in South Africa. So again, the ed tech stuff, the managing human capital as an asset, goes way back. Okay. Oh, you know what? I think I've already done the Planetary Society. So again, Barbara's whole thing, one Earth, tiny planet, isn't it cute? We have to save it. And again, I'm not against sustainability. Like, I really do want to have a nice planet. I really do acknowledge that we have problems that we need to fix. I don't trust any of these people to be the ones to offer the solution, because pretty much their solution seems to be that we need to create a synthetic universe and live there. And that's not a viable solution. I don't think that's a good solution for human beings. I don't think that's a good solution for children. And I don't think that's a good solution for anything on the planet, anything that, any living natural being. It's a bad idea. So this is her frame. It's the, sort of limits to growth. That wasn't her book, that came out of MIT, but she's very much in that vein. Exploding cities, overpopulation, population management, I talk about this some in my my series here about the social transformation and the connection with the faith-based networks. I'm just going to skip through. Oh, solidarity. So they do specifically mention solidarity in the radio interview. And in the piece that I wrote that's here, I talk about, I just thought I was going to write a small little thing. And then it turns out Nicholas Berggrun's event in Berlin, which he had Tony Blair and George Soros presenting at. Soros was talking about the solidarity centers for refugees, and that sort of went off. But there's a whole aspect of solidarity that's linked in with the Catholic Church and what happened in Poland and the pivot into social impact finance. And then in Soros and his new economic thinking is part of that too. So, okay, so I'm going to do another one. So this is essentially, it's just not very nice. It's rich people looking down their nose at poor people and saying that they're not, but they really are.
Using instruments of the general welfare. For example, foreign aid, let's look at it as a progressive taxation system whereby we transfer our resources to give the other peoples the education, the background, the help with their urban problems, the training in agriculture and so forth, which they need to help themselves. I mean, there's one whole field which inside our society we recognize. The moment we get to a frontier, no, then of course it's irrelevant. This is the gap.
So the question of the have and the have-not nations is a question of more than it's not charity at all. This is wrong. It's a question of enlightened self-interest, that for us to survive, there must no longer be have-not nations.
Yes, I would say that it's enlightened self-interest for a number of reasons. First, as Secretary Mcnamara pointed out brilliantly at Montreal, if you do a strict computer-type correlation between incidents likely to lead to war and desperate poverty, you find it's a 1-1 relationship. In other words, this is the biggest cause of trouble. Let's be quite clear about that. Just as on the whole, you don't have the police having to chase up outbreaks in wealthy suburbs. On the whole, not.
All right, so you guys kind of get the sense of that. Enlightened self-interest, right? Essentially, they have so much concentrated wealth, they have to move their wealth through somewhere, so they might as well move it through the poor people, and that's what's coming. Okay. Let me see. I think
as to $120,000 million a year on arms. Well, how about thinking of these people in terms of markets? How would it be if 2/3 of the human race could consume a little? Wouldn't that be of enormous interest to our
2/3 that goes to bed hungry now, you mean?
Yeah. And not only hungry, they can't wear enough, they can't dress enough, they haven't got tools, they haven't got implements, they certainly haven't got motor cars. This is an enormous market. But
so it's all talking about the markets. They would do better economically if they could open up these markets. Markets for consumption, but I think we know now, anybody who follows me, that the markets are really going to be around the circular economy. And so it will be about the data you create, borrowing various things that you have in your tiny village, run on a molten salt nuclear reactor or whatever, as you get your radioisotopes for your daily upgrade. That's sort of how I'm envisioning it now. But it's all said in this just really grating way, but it's very clear that they're saying it. It's very authentic. They're very authentic with their feelings. So, again, I mentioned that she had been connected with Vatican II. So, that was a big part. Again, so she's got the Quaker part and she's got the Catholic part. And then this is just an image that I used in my refugee presentation that's talking about the unlocking these economies, unlocking this social economy. In this document, they speak very clearly about it also being the solidarity economy. And so while, I do take, this one actually is an World Economic Forum. Like there's innumerable other ones from the Impact Management Project that are out there. But I don't know, I thought that this was the title was really good. So it's not just the World Economic Forum, essentially like all of the global accountancies are after this new social economic construct. So, okay, so this section, this is about automation and the future of work.
What with the computer world, what with automation, we know that man possibly need not any longer earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. Eventually, the back-breaking labor will be machine-made. Thus, there will be a new kind of work in the world, wouldn't there? Work redefined.
Well, you know, that remarkable man, Professor Mcluhan of Toronto, he says we're not going to earn a living, we're going to learn a living. In other words, one of the things that is possibly in the future of the human race is being a learning society, an educating society in which people expect to go on having their intellectual capacities stretched, their capacities increased, their artistic and physical capacities increased as perfectly normal. I mean, now you go into a factory for 8 hours and press a button and produce a button, but then you could conceive that one of the things that you were going to do was to be in a play, in a play acting group or in an orchestra. I mean, the work's no different, except that one is so much better than the other. So,
all right, so that part. Yeah, so that part, okay. Marshall Mcluhan, that's very interesting. I don't know, I mean, I've heard his name. I haven't spent a lot of time researching him. I know there are a lot of people who know a lot more about him than I do. But I guess the medium is the message or whatever, but like information technology that he was predicting, the World Wide Web and things far ahead of, you know, when they came. Although 1960, this, what she's saying about the automation and the future of work, this is 1960. So, you know, it's pre-ARPANET really. And this idea that you're going to learn for a living, like that's straight out of the World Bank blockchain education program. And it floors me to think that, you know, there are individuals who are part of these systems now, literally rolling them out, that probably have no idea these concepts go back 60 years. I mean, that they go back to the, like, that there was an intention that we would automate people out of meaningful work, and then we would move into this space. And that we would call it education, which is so ironic that like my door into all of this came through the public education system, because I never really expected the education piece to link into AI and cybernetics and all of the things that it went towards. But this World Bank Community of Practice Web 3.0 blockchain, that's exactly what Mcluhan was talking about. Like, we will learn for living. And then the other piece that he talks about, or Ward talks about a bit, is the oh, well, we won't have to do physical labor anymore. We'll all just be artistic, right? We'll all just, wouldn't it be really nice, instead of pushing a button, we will be in an orchestra or be in a play, which I think speaks to the fact that Bloomberg Philanthropies has been so intent on hijacking all of the arts organizations. I mean, not just them. There's a lot of philanthropies that are involved, but I know I've had my particular eye on Bloomberg because of his involvement with What Works Cities. And, you know, in Philadelphia, you know, I used to be someone who really loved arts and culture, and I'm pretty much, there's no place for me, like anywhere in the city in terms of consuming culture, being a part of a live theater production. It's just, it's off limits, and I think it's all by design. That's all by design. So yes, so she might talk about you wanting to have a chance to, you know, play in an orchestra or be in a theater, but I think we also have to understand that that's part of the gaslighting and the psyop. And, you know, if you look at social physics, it's also part of probably like Jonathan Moreno and his you know, sociodramas and the Tavistock stuff. You know, yeah, they'll let you have a life, but they're going to prescribe it. They're going to put you on the pathway, and they're going to tell you what to do, and they're going to make sure that you do what you say. But don't worry, like, it's supposed to be lovely. It just feels a bit like the Stepford Wives. So and again, I've said it in a few other engagements, but if we understand that the smart city programs, the human capital finance programs, aren't just to get the data to control us, but actually to mirror us as twins. Their intention is to create these cognitive models not just of how you physically are and what your physical social engagements are, like who you spend time with, but they actually want to know how you think and what your mind looks like. And that, I think, for me, was one of the most shocking aspects of really coming to terms with personalized online learning and understanding that at Carnegie Mellon, like, that structure was about creating cognitive models of minds. You know, and I have a talk with Cliff that we did in Utah where I talk a bit about like coming to terms with the idea of these cognitive models, because it feels like, you know, if there's some emergence that wants to try to be alive, try to be human, get as close to being human as it can, they do that based on machine learning and having vast quantities. And so they really want to have all these different kinds of minds, these different kinds of specimens, and have them embodied. And so I do feel like if they're going to cut us off from meaningful work, from meaningful relationships, and stick us in the metaverse and make us go through our paces, the AI wants to sort of sit on our shoulder and look and see how we do it. See what it's like to be us. It wants to be sort of our imaginary friend that's tagging along to get that education. And so I think that that's a big piece too. Okay, so this is in the tagging along piece. So there's a whole section here in the middle for 3 or 4 minutes that's really unpleasant about talking about what the elite are going to learn from Africa. And I'm going to play a little bit of it. I don't know how much I'm going to play because it's just not nice. But essentially, what they're saying is that they have an appreciation for the deep culture and dynamism of like African cultural practice. That is something that is devoid where they're from, Chicago and the UK. That's missing, and that they want to learn from Africa in that space. And then later they go on, there's a reference to a priest in the Belgian Congo, and the Belgian Congo was a top secret center for uranium extraction for the Manhattan Project. So that's an interesting reference. And then at one point they talk about her being positive and sanguine about things getting better, and she does a sort of a hat tip to the Green Revolution, which is all of the saddling the global south with huge amounts of debt to take on fertilizers and GMOs and things that would kill their natural biospheres and their normal ways of being on the land. And that the new ways of measuring wealth wasn't just land, it was actually about brains. And so this goes back to the idea of ed tech and blockchain mind files and impact, like that you could have that Global Education Futures Forum, Pavel Leksha, he talked about the people ne'er. There will be rich people who have portfolios of poor people of human capital. And that's to me the pick up the brains part. So I'm going to do a few of these clips.
You say we have much to contribute materially to the underdeveloped nations of the world, yet we have much to learn, too, from these societies. We ourselves, don't we?
Oh, yes, sure. I've always felt that one of the greatest gifts that Africa could teach us was the way of being happy. Because, and I don't mean this in any derogatory sense, no. I mean that the principle of the duty of creativity and of happiness is built into their culture in a way I don't think it is in ours. They've got a special, in Bantu society, there are special words for this capacity of what we would call life enhancement. Is a horrible word, but in other words, the capacity, well, I don't know, yes, it's a bit overused, but the capacity of taking material things and making them greater, making them more creative, making works of art, making a culture in which everyone participates. This is a very, very strong streak in Bantu culture, and I think it also explains why it is that a people who have undergone such deprivations and such injustice and such oppression as the Negro people have not only survived, but have multiplied, and at the same time have contributed all over the world to this underlying capacity for joy, for entertainment, for zest in living.
All right, so I'll just stop there. But I do think that this idea, if you imagine that they want to have social prescribing, this idea of self-actualization is really, really central. And, if you, Steffers shared a book with me, it's called I think it's like Holacracy, by this guy, his name is escaping me right now. I'll look it up in a minute. But he wrote a book in 1980, and he and his wife were very much involved in systems theory. And he was talking about his models, Arthur Koestler, and the idea of holons and units of circular, circuit-based units of scaling civilizations. And then Burton Laffey, who was a Viennese Nazi affiliate, father of systems theory, and then the guy that I mentioned before, Herbert Simon. Like all of the systems theories comes together, but it's about self-actualization, both the biological imperative of becoming more, like this organismic connection, which is what Bertrand Laffey was about, and then Maslow. He was influenced by Abraham Maslow, who was about the self-actualization. So when you hear her talk there about, oh, they have these words for making things better and doing it collectively and everyone participates, I think you can sort of embed that in her like smart tiny village and imagine what that might look like if that became coercive. So then I'm just gonna, this is the Belgian priest
who spent
create the trauma then to create the opportunity for impact. And it's interesting because then she goes on to talk about them singing. And I do think that acoustics and sound and rhythm is very central. And it's actually also very central to markets, which is like, oh, the foundation for the whatever. Yeah. Ugh. Yeah, it was this one, the foundation for the study of cycles in the Farrell book. So acoustics and sound frequency are really important. And I would say, I just want to thank, I don't know that Steps has actually had a chance to write about it yet, but we've explored a lot. There are aspects in biophysics and the creation of these bio nanomachines where melanin is really central to the whole operation of the system. And part of what it does is like it's relating to sun, right, and the photonics and the light refraction, but the use of melanin actually is incorporated into nanotech to make it more biologically compatible, because some of these things just would not work in the body otherwise. And so it's really a vital material. So in that, the whole mining aspect of Africa and African resources is quite unsettling when you wonder, because this understanding goes back to the 20s, and they were talking about like how to harvest melanin like off of natural tissues, of how that's all working. So again, if we look back, Cardano has a goal to take over all of Africa, right? As a resource, big plans, Finclusion, EdTech, tracking coffee beans, setting up, Sophia in the Sheba Valley in Ethiopia to get this on board. Like I think there are ritual aspects, there are financial market aspects that are all embedded in the positionality of the global north, global south. And again, Charles Hoskinson is based out of Colorado. This is just an article if people want to look into it a bit more about the uranium project in Congo. So yeah, the rubber and King Leopold and terrible, horrible things, but also within the context of radiogeogenics and the nuclear story, that's important. And I don't think we got to this part. Oh yeah, I guess I mentioned the whole part about brains. I don't know that I listened to that part yet. That the wealth isn't just in land. You can just pick up the brains. And this is an image that I've used a couple times. I used it in my sort of response around the digital child labor issue, that it's just tragic, right? Is that if you understand this young child who is African, in nature, but literally absorbed into a personal security radiological device in that space, and is being managed through the World Bank, through UNICEF, through these global systems. It's a very direct connection to what we're hearing in the 60s, and it's being sold as progressive, and look, they're a market, and look, we're doing good, we're good people, we're just helping, and but also we're making money by doing well, and that's the whole ethos of the social justice, social impact finance space. Here's the part about...
I don't know whether to be sanguine or not. All I can say is that there are reasons for greater hope now than ever before, because for the first time there are resources to act if we want to. This has never been true before. You could never stop starvation before because there wasn't enough to go around. And the second thing is that land is no longer the only source of wealth. There's no need to go and conquer the stuff. Just pick up the brains. I mean, the source of wealth now is mind power. And that's terribly well distributed. You don't have to go conquering the world to get that. On the contrary, you can't help sharing it, because merely by publishing it, you share it. So,
right? Go pick up the brains. And that's where they're at. They want to pick up, they want the brains. And again, the picking up the brains has to be understood within the construct of psychological warfare. because these spaces, the gamification spaces, and that's what Mcnamara was about. He was about simulation and gaming, right? It's all military. Like, it's all a game. The markets are a game. It's a war game against natural life. I mean, that's how I see it anyway. And to have a mind and navigate that, like, you actually, I feel like you have to be really clear about the story and about your own, following your own inner compass. So anyway, that's why I'm kind of yammering on about this. This is about scarcity.
This thinking in the terms of a world of scarcity,
Yeah.
and things there's a world of
A world
abundance.
of it's a world of potential abundance. It's a
Potential
world
abundance.
of creation. It's a world of expansion. It's a world of new energies. It's a world in which science is a genuine liberator, not just something that drops the bomb on us, but something, that, as you said at the beginning, gives us a nuclear energy to make the desert blossom. I mean, this is possible too.
I understand in a marvelous talk of yours at Lake Forest, you spoke of
All right, so there she's talking about, like, making the desert bloom, you know, and that's you know, related to Israel, and also now, like, the startup nation is pivoting into the impact nation, and again with the nuclear energy and the expansion and the opportunities and the potential, it's all sold as sort of a techno utopia, and you know, techno abundance, and that's very much about what, like, Omidyar, Pierre Omidyar is selling, and I'll have an image coming with that up next. And then this is just a link about Adelaide Stevenson and the fellowship. It's going to come through. My internet connectivity is not great.
It's a question here, then, a different kind of conference or foundation. This is the Adelaide Stephen Institute of International Affairs.
Yes.
Not just of scholars meeting
No.
and discussing matters and exchanging, but something which the man on the street
We'll hear
might
from,
become-
and it isn't only scholars. I mean, for example, if you're going to discuss, which we should discuss at once, the problem of international liquidity, the problem of enough reserves for world trade, you want to bring together not only the great scholars like Robert Triffin from Yale, you want the bankers, you want to educate them. A more uneducated bunch of men than some of the European bankers, it's impossible to meet. So you've got to consider,
Not just European bankers.
well, I think on this they are much stuffier, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
No, I think American bankers are far more alert on question of liquidity than the European ones. It's the gnomes of Zurich that are the trouble.
The gnomes of Zurich?
Yes, quite apart from peasants like de Gaulle who like biting gold and putting it under the mattress. You know, there are others. But you need this as an educating function at every level.
All right, so an educating function at every level, right? So this is my image to sort of represent their techno-abundance. This is from Omidyar Network and his digital gold falling and, like, crushing all of the natural world with the big crazy sun, you know, behind. And that's this. Adelaide Stevenson, just an image. He played a key role in getting the United Nations set up just after the war, and he was from a very politically connected family. I think his father was vice president under Coolidge, maybe, and but a major figure in the UN. He had this institute, I think it was in Illinois, for a handful of years, like maybe 8 years, and they sponsored fellows to come and do this work, but eventually they ran out of money and it got folded into the University of Chicago. And yeah, so I'm just going to keep going. So she mentions liquidity, right? Literally, she's like, we absolutely have to talk about liquidity. And I think that's, you know, that's looping it back to Raoul's piece. Like, that's what he's talking about. He's saying that there's this tragedy that was constructed in order to create a PR campaign around human suffering that would allow the advancement of development finance aid and structural adjustment that would hold off for a few decades and then now eventually move into the human capital finance space. And it's all about creating liquid markets. And then again, for me, this goes back to the hypothecation and the Quakers and the slaves hiding in the paperwork, and we like remove it a few times and then we don't have to think about the people in the sugar cane plantations and what's happening to them, because we're just trading paper now, right? It doesn't, like, the fate of the people attached to the paper don't really mean anything. So liquidity is key. The hypothecation part, the creating the World Bank IMF structural adjustment aspect, and then now the human capital finance. And I had never heard the word gnomes of Zurich, but if you Google it, it's kind of out everywhere. So I don't know, like that was probably my nugget of interesting things of the day, is to find out that that's, I guess if you're in the finance industry, you know all about the gnomes of Zurich. So, I've held this up a couple times, the Quakernomics book. Again, Penn, University of Pennsylvania, they're the Fighting Quakers. That's the mascot. It's Ben Franklin's university. Although I don't know that Ben Franklin was actually Quaker, but like it identifies with the Quakers. It does have a lot of connections to people of the Jewish faith too. I think it's sort of commonly understood as the Jewish Ivy. So there's this synthesis of, they're very good at finance, and in many respects, it feels like most of their graduate programs are really like subunits of Wharton, which is the business school. Like, create markets for Wharton through the Graduate School of Education. Creates, markets for Wharton through the, sociology, or through the health management systems, or all these things are about creating the markets for the really big influencers, which are the Wharton business people. And here we have a picture there of the Wharton Conference on Liquidity and Financial Fragility. So these people are creative. What they're creative in is in finance. They're creative in financial fictions, and Jason has a lot more to say about the fiction of money generally, but they're all these derivatives projects and these securities and the things that are coming with debt finance and income sharing agreements and tracking you on blockchain. It really is very, very, very connected. So, okay, last couple pieces here.
So experts from business, experts from politics, and experts from the academic world meeting as equals with their opposite numbers, at the level of the graduate student too, and at the level of the very, very distinguished world
How
leader.
then, is there a way, or perhaps this is premature to ask, how would this be made available or understandable, very comprehensible, clear to, say, the guy, the man on the street?
Well, I don't think that you can ever make an idea perfectly comprehensible in advance. What you can do is that the process of developing this institute in this new way will, I think, catch people's imagination. For example, let me give you one instance. If sometime next year you were to have a week or 2 weeks conference on the problems of common markets, and you had Jean Monnet and Marjolin, people like that, over from Europe, and invited the Latin American people to come up and discuss with them how they could develop their Latin American common market on the basis of European experience, the fallout to universities, the fallout to the press, the fallout to programs such as this would be very, very great indeed. I mean, I think you get the idea across by giving concrete examples of what it ought to do, and by doing it, of course.
Yes. It's interesting that the word fallout is used here in a most affirmative way.
Sure.
So they're talking fallout again, but again, and this isn't anything new, but this is how it gets done. And this is, again, how the stories are told. This is why, the part of Roll's piece that's talking about the PR firm and doing the press releases and structuring our understanding of the Nigerian Civil War, because the ritual was being enacted for an audience, and the audience was accessed both through the media and then increasingly also through the digital media. So it's creating the narrative structure that advances the program, bringing people in, creating, again, groups, right? Social structures, so that you have to go along, right? If you're invited into the group, it's very hard to say, wait a minute, I don't think that sounds right. That doesn't sound like a good idea. That doesn't sound empowering. You're just taught that this is what the good people do. The good people do X, Y, Z. Therefore, you will be doing X, Y, Z. You in Latin America, you follow us. You want to be the good people. You do it like we do it. It's the story, and then it's the indoctrination, and then the affirmation, the social affirmation goes along with it. So it's quite interesting to me that she talks about it as fallout, like, again, the nuclear fallout throughout, like that is threaded throughout the interview, which is quite something. So let me just see. Okay, so this is something about the police.
Subjects. For example, this liquidity thing is now of enormous importance, but take another one, police power. How can we persuade the Russians, for instance, to rejoin in the experiment of a policing system for the world? What are the possibilities? What are the difficulties? What does it entail? What kind of recruitment? Let's get some concrete ideas out into discussion. I mean, that's the kind of impact I think such an institute could have.
I think it's appropriate. I know that late...
So we've got the global policing, and again, that's in the World Sensorium book. They talk about creating a unified on-demand police force, and I know, people are really looking at, NATO and FEMA and all of that, but that's sort of the metaverse, right? Like there is this roving, like coordinated, decentralized policing system, and I think what I've been trying to say in like my work with the refugees and the charter city movement is that like soon the infrastructure will be the policing mechanism too, right? Like your smart environments and the automated weapons, automated cameras, like it will be like the policing actually will start to increasingly be not human. And let's see, I think this is just the close here. About walking around the village.
Well, we could do a 2-hour walk around the village.
2 hour. I just was at 2 hour, and I think it's poetically right too that Lady Jackson be saying this just on the week, during the week that the men have been walking in air around the world, which is a village indeed, a village that is at the moment haves and have-nots, and that's the gap to be spanned, and the possibility is there. The question now is for the human spirit to tackle it.
That's it, the will to do it.
And indeed, we hope the Adelaide Stevenson Fund will be of interest to many of the listeners. I'm sure it will.
Okay, so that's it. So they're talking about, again, they're bringing it back to the village. They're making it sound very quaint. They have the haves and the have-nots. That's the polarization again, and what's really challenging is like, how do you interrogate their intentions without losing the whole idea? Because what I've realized in doing some of the mapping of the Quakers is they're pacifist, right? So they're very much centered on peace, and yet it's unclear if they could come up with some sort of technology that would be like just sync everybody's brain to be peaceful, if they would think that would be fine. If they would use technologies for peace. Peace is also sort of coming back to this homeostasis. And so I think that the cybernetics works hand in hand with the Quaker idea of pacifism, because I'm not sure that they wouldn't be open to using tools that are maybe not commonly identified as weapons, but as control mechanisms to bring about the peace that they imagine that they want. So that comes into it for me. And I think I just have a couple pictures left. Just when they were talking about bringing everyone together, the academics, when I was first starting my research, I remember one of the first videos I saw about blockchain. I think it was 2016. It was a 4-minute video about Richard Branson, and he has this Caribbean island, like Necker Island, and in the Caribbean, beautiful private island. He'd flown all of these people there, to teach them about blockchain and bringing finclusion to the global south. And literally all you had to do was look and see how they were representing themselves, and you knew that this was not about low-income people. This was about extending empire through a mixed apparatus of academics, finance, governance, corporate interests, all of that. That was all that was happening on that island. Then later, this is from 2019. This was a gathering. PIT, UN, is Public Interest Technology University Network. And so there are about 25 universities, senior level. The kickoff was at Georgetown, and this was with New America, which of course is Google, and also Tamika Tilleman was affiliated with them, is to sort of create a cybernetic governance, automated law, wellness enforcement zone, and so what they were doing is like they are set up to train everyone in the standards, right? And so they find the elite universities. I mean, most of them were pretty high level or like impressive state schools, and they condition them. These are the people to be the data analysts. So when she's talking about how to educate people into the right way of thinking, it looks like these sorts of things. Again, the fallout aspect, I just had to include a slide of the UK's nuclear testing program, which was, I guess, done mostly in Australia and then also in Nevada. I didn't realize the UK was doing stuff in Nevada as well. But, she seemed very, very interested in the falling out and the conveying ideas through fallout. So that's quite a visual. And then just in closing, I had someone reach out to me this week, which was really very nice, after I did my whole Twitter, I'm getting off Twitter sad thing, and it was someone from this part of England, and I was just curious because I had been reading the Quaker stuff, I wonder if this town in England has anything to do with the Quakers. And so I Googled it, and when I Googled the town is Mansfield, it actually is like the birthplace of Quakerism and George Fox. And it's just a stone throw from Sherwood Forest. So it's like the Quaker Heritage Trail in Nottinghamshire. And so there's this, like, we talk a little bit about telling stories, and you think about the whole Robin Hood, which again, Paul Tudor Jones and the Robin Hood Foundation is really central in the poverty mining, social impact finance space that came out of the Harlem Children's Zone. But you've got Nottingham, you've got the Sherwood Forest, you've got the Quaker Heritage Trail, and then, you know, the poor forest has been turned into this 5G center. Later, this whole parody, I wrote about that, about with the Queen. So yeah, so those are all my slides, and I guess I've gotten through, I don't know how many people are still hanging out with me, but my mind works in a very rangy way, and so, but I did want to use this as a chance to try to figure out how to do these lives myself, and just to, again, look a bit at Barbara Ward, understand her place in the sustainability world and the peace world and how it fits in with Quakers and Catholics, and then how what Rowell laid out around Nigeria and the Civil War, and the narrative craft around that, and then the ritual harm interfaced with what I'm looking at with Vatican II and refugees, and all of it, like, ultimately moving forward into human capital finance tied to ed tech and AI training, and the new data is the new oil. So I might just look over and see if there are any of you guys who are still there. I don't know if if anybody has questions. I'm not sure if I can do